The First Crusade was a monumental event that shook the medieval world. It began in the year 1096 and lasted until 1099, marking the first in a series of religious wars between Christians and Muslims. Imagine a time when faith was at the very center of everyone's life. The story starts when the Byzantine Emperor Alexios the Komnenos, who ruled a vast Christian empire in the east, sent a desperate plea for help to the Pope in Rome. His lands were being threatened by the Seljuk Turks, and he needed skilled soldiers to push them back. This simple request for military aid would soon ignite a movement far larger and more complex than anyone could have ever predicted, setting thousands of people on a long and dangerous path to the Holy Land. This journey was not just a military campaign, it was a pilgrimage of unprecedented scale. For centuries, Christians had traveled to Jerusalem to visit the places where Jesus Christ was said to have lived and died. However, by the late 11th century, these routes had become more difficult and dangerous. The idea of taking back these sacred sites by force began to take hold in the minds of many Western Europeans. The First Crusade was therefore framed as a mission to protect fellow Christians and to reclaim the holiest city in Christendom, Jerusalem, from Muslim control. It was a concept that blended the duty of a warrior with the devotion of a pilgrim, creating a powerful and compelling call to action that resonated across all levels of society. The journey itself was incredibly perilous, stretching over 2,000 miles of difficult and often hostile territory. Those who answered the call, known as Crusaders, faced immense challenges. They had to cross rugged mountains, vast plains, and scorching deserts. They battled starvation, disease, and exhaustion long before they ever met an enemy in combat. Many who left their homes in France, Germany, and Italy would never see them again. The sheer scale of the undertaking is hard to comprehend today. It required a level of belief and determination that was truly extraordinary, as entire families sold their possessions to fund a trip from which they might never return, driven by a shared purpose that united them on their quest. So what was the First Crusade at its core? It was a massive armed pilgrimage, a military response to a political plea, and a deeply religious movement all rolled into one. It brought together people from all walks of life, from powerful noblemen seeking glory to poor farmers hoping for salvation. It reshaped the map of the Middle East and forever changed the relationship between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Understanding this event means looking at the complex web of reasons that convinced tens of thousands of people to leave everything behind and march towards a distant city, a city they believed was their sacred inheritance and worth dying for. It was the beginning of a new chapter in history, written in faith and blood. The spark that truly ignited the First Crusade was a powerful speech given by Pope Urban II in 1095. At the Council of Clermont in France, he spoke to a crowd of bishops, nobles, and common people. His words were carefully chosen and incredibly effective. He described the suffering of Christians in the East, painting a vivid picture of holy places being desecrated and pilgrims being attacked on their way to Jerusalem. He called upon the knights of Europe, who were often fighting amongst themselves, to turn their swords away from their Christian brothers and instead use their strength for a higher, holier purpose. This was a masterful piece of oratory designed to stir the emotions and faith of his audience. Pope Urban II offered a remarkable incentive for those who would take up the cross and join this armed pilgrimage. He promised something that everyone, rich or poor, deeply desired: the remission of all their sins. In a world where the fear of eternal damnation was very real, this was an incredibly powerful motivator. It was a spiritual reward of the highest order. This promise, known as an indulgence, meant that anyone who died on the journey to the Holy Land would be assured a place in heaven. It transformed a dangerous military campaign into a direct path to salvation, making the risks seem not only acceptable, but divinely sanctioned and worthwhile. The Pope's message was not just about saving souls, it also cleverly addressed earthly problems. Europe at the time was plagued by violence. knights and lords frequently fought over land and honor, causing instability and suffering for ordinary people. Pope Urban II presented the crusade as an outlet for this aggression. He effectively said, "Stop fighting each other. Here is a common enemy, a righteous cause, that is worthy of your skill and courage." This redirected the violent energies of the warrior class towards an external foe, promising them a chance to use their martial skills in the service of God, which was a very appealing idea for many knights. This call to arms spread like wildfire across Europe. Preachers, inspired by the Pope's message, traveled from town to town, village to village, repeating his sermon and recruiting people for the cause. The most famous of these was Peter the Hermit, a charismatic figure who gathered a massive following of ordinary people known as the People's Crusade. The message was simple but effective: God wills it. This phrase, Deus vult in Latin, became the rallying cry of the Crusaders. It captured the absolute conviction that their mission was not just a human idea, but a divine command, making it an unstoppable force. The First Crusade was not a single unified army, but a collection of different groups with different leaders and different motivations. On one side, you had the powerful princes and high-ranking nobles who led the main armies. Men like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Beaumont of Taranto were experienced military commanders. For them, the crusade was certainly a religious duty, but it was also a grand opportunity. They could gain immense prestige, carve out new lands for themselves in the east, and accumulate vast wealth. Beaumont, for example, was a Norman knight from southern Italy who saw the crusade as a chance to create his own kingdom, which he successfully did by capturing the city of Antioch. These leaders were driven by a mixture of piety and personal ambition. Godfrey of Bouillon, for instance, sold or mortgaged much of his land to finance his expedition, suggesting a genuine religious commitment. After the successful capture of Jerusalem, he was offered the title of king, but famously refused, choosing the more humble title, Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. This shows that for him, the religious aspect was paramount. However, the desire for power was never far away. The princes often argued among themselves over who would control the cities they conquered, revealing that earthly ambitions were just as important as heavenly rewards in their minds. Their journey was a quest for God, but also for glory. It wasn't just the princes and knights who answered the call. A huge number of ordinary people, including farmers, artisans, and even whole families, joined the movement. This was most famously seen in the People's Crusade, led by Peter the Hermit. These common folk were likely less concerned with gaining land or power. For them, the motivation was overwhelmingly religious. They were inspired by the promise of salvation and a deep personal faith. They believed they were taking part in a divine event and that God would protect them. Many sold all their belongings, packed up their families, and set off with little more than faith to guide them. Sadly, the experience of these ordinary people was often tragic. The People's Crusade, which set off before the main armies of the knights, was largely undisciplined and unprepared for the long journey. They lacked the supplies, training, and leadership of the noble-led forces. When they reached Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, they were quickly and easily defeated by the Seljuk Turks, and many were killed or sold into slavery. Their story is a powerful reminder that while faith was a profound motivator, it was not always enough to overcome the harsh realities of war and logistics. Their journey highlights the purely religious zeal that drove many to join the cause, even if it led them to disaster. When we ask whether the First Crusade was a holy war or a power play, the evidence points strongly in both directions. The argument for it being a holy war is compelling. Religion was the central organizing principle of medieval society, and the idea of reclaiming Jerusalem for Christendom was a powerful spiritual goal. The promises made by Pope Urban II, offering forgiveness of sins, resonated deeply with a population that lived with a constant awareness of the afterlife. The personal accounts of some Crusaders, who wrote about their spiritual experiences and their willingness to die for their faith, show a genuine piety that cannot be dismissed as a mere excuse for violence or greed. Furthermore, The sheer sacrifice involved suggests that for many, this was more than just an adventure. Nobles sold their ancestral lands, and commoners left the only homes they had ever known to embark on a journey from which they were unlikely to return. The symbol of the crusade itself, a cloth cross sewn onto their garments, marked them as pilgrims on a sacred mission, not just soldiers in an army. For these individuals, the war was a devotional act, an extreme form of pilgrimage. They were fighting for what they saw as God's territory, and their actions, however violent, were justified in their minds as carrying out the will of God. This perspective sees the crusade as an expression of intense religious fervor. On the other hand, the argument for the crusade being a power play is equally strong. The late 11th century was a time of land-hungry and ambitious knights with limited opportunities at home. The crusade offered a perfect chance to acquire land, wealth, and status abroad. The actions of many of its leaders support this view. The intense rivalries between them, such as the dispute between Raymond of Toulouse and Beaumont over the city of Antioch, were clearly about power and control, not just religious ideals. They were carving up conquered territories to create their own personal fiefdoms, the so-called Crusader states, which were built on military conquest. Ultimately, it is nearly impossible to separate these two motivations. The First Crusade was a complex phenomenon where faith and ambition were completely intertwined. For a medieval knight, serving God and increasing his own power were not necessarily contradictory goals. They could be seen as one and the same. A knight could genuinely believe he was fighting for Christ, while also seizing a castle for himself, seeing earthly success as a sign of God's favor. The First Crusade was therefore both a holy war and a power play. It was a movement driven by sincere faith, but it was executed by ambitious and often ruthless men. The question that remains for us to consider is which of these powerful forces was the true driving engine of this historic event.